and I'm delighted to introduce our neighbor, Vanessa De Gifis, who is a scholar of early Islamic thought. She works in particular on the Qur'an, how the Qur'an generated the sciences of language, and how Arabic rhetoric took shape through study of and reaction to the Qur'an. Vanessa received her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilization from the University of Chicago in 2008. Her first book, Shaping a Qur'anic Worldview, looks at how the political theory of the Caliphate of the 9th century of the Common Era mobilized Qur'anic citations in order to generate a sense of a moral public sphere and to pursue its own kind of political goals. In this book and in her articles, Vanessa thinks about rhetoric as political performance and about the Qur'an as didactic instrument, as an agent of change, an articulation of, and a provocation to an emergent Muslim community, a Muslim moral community during the early Islamic centuries in particular. She is also recently interested in the Qur'anic theme of divine favor and in Qur'anic parable exegesis. Again, seeing these topics as ways of generating connections between the political realm and the realm of revelation. Vanessa is currently associate professor of, I'm not going to say the name of the department now, he's at Wayne State. She also serves in the executive office of the International Qur'anic Studies Association, and as the organization's blog coordinator, she mediates a global public conversation on Qur'anic scholarship. So not only does she have her finger on the pulse of the second Islamic century, she's also helping to shape the future of Qur'anic scholarship. The title of her talk is Qur'anic Paradigms and Analogies in Caliphal Rhetoric. Please join me in welcoming Vanessa.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carla, Maite, Danny, everybody for inviting me and organizing this event, and thank you all of you for coming to this event. Thank you for the introduction. I think you're maybe more articulate than I will be in just describing what I'm doing. But here's my attempt to describe what I do. So, as you know, the title suggests, I'm looking at Qur'anic paradigms in the scripture. We have stories, parables, rhetoric and debate and polemic, a variety of literary forms. And we have analogies to many of the characters, events, and ideas in political rhetoric, oftentimes transposing the literary forms themselves and usually tweaking the literary forms in order to situate them in a new rhetorical context. What prompted this sort of study was really a basic question of how do Muslims use the Qur'an to make sense of the world around them? It is really not surprising that Muslims do this. I mean, that's not really up for debate. I mean, you ask anybody on the street, any Muslim that you would meet will probably tell you, well, yeah, I look to the Qur'an as a guide, you know, a guide to understand the history of my faith community, to situate myself in the world, understand my role in the world, and to forecast my destiny. Despite the kind of general acknowledgement that the Qur'an is a guide for understanding our place in the world, the Muslims' place in the world, relatively little scholarship has dealt with the practical mechanics of how that happens. There are quite a lot actually of studies of references to the Qur'an in legal theory in order to come up with a legal stipulation, right? And of course, legal analogy is an important part of that, analogizing from the text for legal opinion. But it's really only recently that academicians in the West are concerned not just with the kind of legal theoretical aspect of the impact of the Qur'an on Islamic thought and Muslim daily life, but on the broader outlook and disposition of Muslims, right? And so I and a few other people within Qur'anic studies itself is a fairly small field, and within that are the kind of exegetical or hermeneutical subfield, and then within that are people who are looking at the impact of the Qur'an on Islamic thought through rhetorical and literary analyses. So it's a small but growing topic, and what we want to do is try to understand the practical mechanics of how and why Muslims bring the Quranic text to bear in real-world decision-making. And rhetoric, in many ways, is more useful than, say, dialectic or legal argumentation in order to discern dispositions and outlooks of Muslims in the social world, because rhetoric is about shaping conviction, not necessarily discerning an objective truth, right? So in that sense, rhetoric is a particularly interesting domain to explore the use of the Qur'an in formulating thought. And Qur'anic referencing has an impact on both the structure and the intellection, right, of the Qur'an's relevance, right? So it's structurally embedded in the way people talk about their world, and as a result is conceptually integrated to it. Now, the main points that I'll be addressing through my presentation: the first one, the Qur'an as a guide for making sense of the social world, right? Which has often, been generally in a cliched way recognized as something that is true, but how, right? Really, to address it, principally we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the Qur'an, right? The Qur'an has stories of past communities. It has descriptions of divine powers and human inclinations. It has prescriptions for the moral life. And it has threats and promises for the end times. And in so doing, it depicts past, present, and future scenarios for the community of readers. The language of the Qur'an itself, shifting voice, the use of imperative mood, second-person address, things like that, are also a particular style of the Qur'anic text that really engages and pulls the reader in, so that those stories aren't just narrations of the past or talking about someone else, but are really directly implicating the reader in the social world of the Qur'an. And so it's not surprising then that Muslims would read that text and want to, in a sense, extend that realm of involvement that the Qur'an has. It summons the reader into the life of the text, into that community, and referencing is really a way to kind of extend that, to extend that continuum of past, present, and future, and in a sense summon the political audience now to inhabit that social world of the Qur'an, and in the process fulfill the eschatological promises of that polity. You'll have to forgive me, I have a very sore throat today, so I'll be drinking a lot. Okay, the second point is the analogical function of Qur'anic referencing. The Qur'an is used to as a lens to make sense of lived experience, right? So usually what happens is a political scenario presents itself, someone has an issue right on the ground, and it reminds them in some way of some character or scenario in the Qur'anic text, which of course assumes that there's some memory of that text, right? And then it sets into motion that the quest for a relevant passage that may be invoked in order to steer the audience to a certain attitude or action in that political scenario. The principle of analogy is that when something is uncertain, lesser known, possibly confusing, we don't know what to make of something, we seek to better understand the lesser known with reference to what is more known. The Qur'an, then, is a body of more known examples, right? The stories and character types in the Qur'an are more known particular reference points that they can say, okay, well, we know about these characters, these good guys or these bad guys or these commands. How can we transpose them onto the present scenario in order to make sense of the present scenario, which is relatively more confusing, more up for debate? So what we find is that Qur'anic referencing tends to happen most in scenarios of conflict and confusion, chaos, and the quest for order. Right? When there is disorder, we seek order. When things are unknown, we have recourse to what is known. The third point, Qur'anic premises and universal principles. The whole idea that the Qur'an is more known is very important when you're thinking about its use in rhetoric, because the premise of any rhetorical analogy has to be grounded, or to be effective really, should be grounded on a presumed belief that the audience will virtually instantaneously assent to as the basis for the next thing you're trying to convince them of, right? The Qur'an, it's reasonable that a politician would think that the Qur'an would, in fact, contain material and teachings to which a Muslim audience would be ready to assent. And this is grounded in the idea that the Qur'an is of divine origin, right? Believers in the Qur'an believe that it, because it is God's word, it has moral and rhetorical authority. And of course, the act itself of Qur'anic referencing, where these examples from the Qur'an are transposed into a new context, seems to, in fact, affirm this idea that there is a certain universality to the examples in the text. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't make reference to them. Politicians are notoriously pragmatic, and they're not going to do something if they don't predict that it will be effective. The fourth point, typological reading. I am first going to suggest that Qur'anic referencing is a form of typological reading of the text of the Qur'an. And that is because really the text of the Qur'an itself lends itself to a typological reading, because oftentimes the characters in the Qur'an are not specifically named, with the exception of a few biblical prophets and past communities. Most characters in the Qur'an are not given specific names. There are no clear delimitations of time and geographical space in the Qur'an. And so without those delimitations, we have really more general, really typological schemes, right? These types of scenarios of conflict, not a specific conflict in history at a certain time and place with certain actors, right? But a more general pattern of human behavior and history that God is concerned with and occasionally intervenes in. So we have certain ways to denote classes or types of people, like those who believe, those who lie, those who associate other things with God. Right? These are general designations which are very readily adaptable to new rhetorical circumstances. These sorts of types, and I'm focusing specifically on personal character types, the characters of humans, like believer, disbeliever, that sort of thing, stimulates the metaphorical imagination, right? Reference to these things stimulates the metaphorical imagination and calls upon the audience to locate themselves in that typology, right? Which moral type do I fit or do I want to fit? The type of the disbeliever is a very prevalent character type in political rhetoric because, as I said earlier, Qur'anic referencing is usually invoked in times of crisis and conflict, and those are also, of course, the times when we're dealing with adversaries, right? This is adversarial discourse more often than not that generates Qur'anic referencing. And so the paradigm of the disbeliever, who is, numerously referred to in the Quran as those who disbelieve or the disbelievers, and of course who they are is quite vague in the Quranic text itself, right? They are often referenced in some way in political rhetoric. Now, this shows you, I hope this works, yes? You can still hear me, all right? Okay. It shows you some of the, whoops, oh, I'm sorry. I meant to use the little thingy, this thing. There we go. So these are predicates of the disbeliever, right? If the disbelievers are subject, right? These are the things that are attributed to them, right? For example, they are deaf and blind. These are in the Quran, right? The disbelievers are predicated with deafness and blindness, with rejecting the truth, lying, debating falsely, and as a result, they are condemned, right? So we have predicates that are on some level descriptive, and really on some level the word disbelievers is descriptive, but it has an aura of evaluation to it. It implies that these people are bad, right? Deafness, blindness, a metaphor in the Quran for ignorance and error, or being not rightly guided. And interestingly, in Quranic referencing and political rhetoric, the politician very seldom, in fact, in all the research I've done, including the earliest fitnas with Ali and Muawiyah up through Ma'mun's Mihna, so from the 7th century through the 9th century, I can't really think of a single time that word was explicitly stated, right? Instead, what is often stated in a Quranic allusion are the predicates, right? So-and-so is deaf and blind, so-and-so rejects the truth, and oftentimes the inference is that they are disbelievers and that they are condemned, or that the condemnation that the politician has for their adversary is justified because God himself has condemned them as disbelievers, right? So these are kind of the common links, right? Now, believers, right, we have the same thing. We have certain predications of believers as a positive, good character type, right? They adhere to the truth, not lies, right? They take God as a guarantor. They default against the treacherous, right? In other words, they don't ally with the bad guys, right? They fight the disbelievers, and they are victorious, right? All of these predicates I actually draw from concrete examples. These aren't just things I randomly pulled out of the canonical text to illustrate. I mean, these are, in fact, predicates referenced in political rhetoric more often than not. Yeah, and we have these kind of causal relationships, right? Because they do this, they are classified as that, and because of their belonging in this class, they will be victorious, or they will be saved, or they are, you know, people we want to have as friends, that sort of thing. And so what we have with referencing is, whoops, there I go again using the wrong button. I'm so sorry. So what we have is a really complex hermeneutic circle, right? This isn't a simple sort of two-ingredient hermeneutic circle of text and reader, right? Where in the process of reading a text, it actually shapes the way we think about the text. And so the way that we interact with the text is kind of evolving in the process of processing the text, right? But with referencing, we kind of have a third gear working as well, right? Because the reader, familiar with the Qur'an, is reminded of it through some circumstance in the social world, turns to the Qur'an for some sort of reference, right? And then through his mediation kind of conveys his take on how this applies to his scenario in the social world, and right? So it's a somewhat complex relationship and an interactive one, right? Because of course the audience that is passively maybe consuming political rhetoric also has familiarity with the Qur'an more often than not. The Qur'an is a very valuable rhetorical tool because it is more often than not memorized by those who care about it. And they would presumably have their own take on things. Now then, I'm going to get into the theory and practice of analogical reasoning as a specific tool for logically controlling or attempting to control one's understanding of the Qur'an's pertinence to a political situation, right? That process of drawing likeness. And the idea is that rhetorical use of the Qur'an is rational and measurable for analysis, right? These aren't vague impressions. We can, in fact, see a very logical and granted emotional, because rhetoric is all about using logic to steer emotion, right? But it is a logically ordered process. In order to understand Qur'anic referencing in the formative and classical period of the Caliphate, I wanted to have a sort of empathic awareness of the rhetorical culture of that time and place. So I used the closest available primary sources on rhetorical theory from the early medieval Islamic world, Arabic Islamic rhetorical theory. Farabi and Ibn Rushd. Farabi died around 950, Ibn Rushd maybe around 1198 or something, so they're a little bit later than, say, Ma'mun, who died in 833. But what's interesting about Farabi and Ibn Rushd is that, and Jahid's actually was another one that I looked at, but they are more elaborate than Jahid was, Jahid was actually a contemporary of Ma'mun, but he doesn't systematize a rhetorical theory the way that these guys do. The nice thing about Jahid as a rhetorical theorist, or commentator at least, is that he does in fact put the Qur'an at the heart of his theory of rhetoric. The Qur'an as lucid speech is lucid speech par excellence, right? That is really kind of the yardstick for all excellent Arabic rhetoric. These guys not so much, because they're working within the Aristotelian tradition, and so the Qur'an is kind of not really something they directly deal with in their theories, but what's of interest to us now is their theory of analogical reasoning, which is very highly developed in the Aristotelian tradition. There are two classes of rhetorical analogy that they identify and which we find operating in Qur'anic referencing, the example and the enthymeme. There are three types of exemplary analogy that Farabi and Ibn Rushd identified. Remember now, the whole purpose of analogy is to understand something lesser known with reference to something better known, right? So likenesses, in other words, those things that are similar to the thing we're trying to understand, right? A likeness, we look for a likeness in the Quran, something we can say, well, this is like what we're dealing with, right? A likeness, because it is Qur'anic, is a better known, right? Now, the theorists are careful to remind us that these are better known particulars, right? So we're not talking about some grand universal theory in the Quran that is being referenced, but in fact, other particulars, right? Like a character type, right? Like so-and-so did such and such, or these types of people do these types of things. They are, as far as analogical theory goes, they are in fact still particulars. One type of analogy is that if the question is, does a predicate P apply to the subject S, right? That's the question. In order to answer that question, we could say, well, the predicate applies or pertains to the likeness of the subject. The likeness of the predicate applies to the subject. So, for example, if someone lies about taxes, they might also lie about the Quran or something like that, right? Likeness of the predicate applies to the likeness of the subject, right? So these are the three types of analogies, right? And the first and the third are the most common ones that we find in Qur'anic referencing, right? Where it's really the likeness of a subject that is involved in Qur'anic analogy. It's quite rare that we find anything of this type where a likeness of the predicate is applied to the political subject, right? So it's really the first and third that we find most in Qur'anic referencing. Now, the enthymeme is the second major class of analogy. It is actually foundational to the example because the logic of the examples that we just saw, those are undergirded by the logic of enthymeme. Examples only make sense because somehow behind the scenes we are thinking logically about the relationships between those things. They may not be explicated in a logical formulation, but the enthymeme is the logic undergirding example. But enthymeme is also, there I go again, I'm so sorry. My goodness. There we go. The enthymeme is the logic undergirding example. It is also a distinct structural form of referencing, right? So someone could cite an example implying enthymematic logic, or one can actually structure explicitly what they're trying to say in the form of enthymeme. Enthymeme is an abridged syllogism in which one of the two premises is suppressed. This is typical of rhetoric, right? For concision and also to kind of make the audience complicit in your argument, you kind of hide half the argument and let them fill in the blank for you. That's basically what an enthymeme is, right? So a classic syllogism where all three, the premises and the conclusion are not suppressed would be something like this. And this is not Qur'anic, this is just for an example. Liars are condemned. That's the major, more universal premise. Zayd is a liar. Therefore, Zayd is condemned, right? That's your classic syllogism, right? In an enthymeme, you would suppress one of those elements. So you would say something like, Zayd is condemned because liars are condemned, right? The minor premise has been suppressed, right? Zayd is condemned because liars are condemned. Right? Or you could suppress the major premise and say, Zayd is condemned because Zayd is a liar, right? And it would only be implied or left to your audience to infer complicitly with you that, well, liars are condemned. Farabi and Ibn Rushd recommend that the major premise be the one that is usually suppressed. You suppress the one that is the most universally acceptable, so you can trust that they'll fill in the blank right, or the one that is the most dubious, because you don't want to draw attention to the weakest element of your argument. So it's either the best element or the worst element of your argument you will suppress, right? There's also variations on the enthymeme. One in particular to note is where the conclusion itself may be suppressed, right? You'd say, liars are condemned and Zayd is a liar, right? So the conclusion that Zayd is condemned has been suppressed and the audience is meant to infer that. Now we're going to turn to specific examples of Qur'anic referencing to illustrate these points. In the interest of time, I'm not going to give a whole spiel about the historical context, but I will a few things. First thing is that historical context does matter, because the whole point of Qur'anic referencing is establishing a relationship between the Qur'anic text and something in the political milieu. So as a researcher, you need to understand that political milieu in order to understand that co-referentiality, right? That being said, just to keep it short and sweet for our sake, right? This is an example taken from the Caliphate of al-Ma'mun, the very famous 9th century caliph. He ruled for quite a long time, 20 years. He acceded to the caliphate by way of civil war against his brother, so his kind of getting there was kind of a rocky way to get there. So he spent pretty much all his 20 years trying to validate himself, as most politicians do. This is actually taken from his mihna, which is a very famous test that he administered to people in his courts to make sure that they have sound religion in order to function in his judiciary. It was ostensibly a theological text on the nature of the Quran. And so he launches his mihna with these very elaborate letters that not only give us a series, like 13, 14, quotes from the Quran that he interprets in order to show that the Quran is in fact created in time, which is his theological assertion that he wants to test people on. But he also couches the mihna itself in Quranic referencing by, among many other things, characterizing his opponents, which are mainly hadith traditionists, characterizing the hadith folk in a negative light, aligned with the bad character types in the Quran, namely the disbelievers and the hypocrites, which for various reasons Ma'mun could not come straight out and call them, right? So he does this. And this is just one example of what he says about the hadith folk. He quotes Quran 691. Ma'mun says, they say, and this is actually, this they say is Quranic text, right? He's quoting the Quran. They say God has not sent anything down to man. Then by the tongue of his messenger he makes them liars and says to his messenger, say, who sent down the book that Moses brought? This is the original Quranic text. The underlined text is Ma'mun's interjection. He's actually interrupting the verse to add some sort of logical, kind of philological gap, actually, in the verse. Now, this particular verse, 691, the they in the Quran, if you look at the Quranic co-text, and we want to limit our recourse to the exegetical kind of asbab and nuzul literature as much as we can, but the Quranic co-text, it's quite clear that the they in the Quran are Jews who say God has not sent anything down to man, right? So denying the revelation that the messenger Muhammad is sending. And so this verse, they say, very typical kind of dialogue debate that the Quran does, they say God has not sent anything down. Say, this is God telling Muhammad to say to these people, these wrong people, who sent down the book that Moses brought. So he's instructing the prophet to refute a lie or error of these people. Ma'mun applies this. This would be actually a good example of the third type of enthymeme, the likeness of the predicate applying to the likeness of the subject, because a similar type of lie, it's not the exact same, but we have a similar type of, God has not sent anything down to man, which is similar to the lie of the hadith folk when they say that God has not created the Qur'an, right? Sent down or created is kind of the similarity here. And his interruption is in fact a very key element in the enthymematic logic, right? Because he's actually, in fact, he makes them liars, right? This, in fact, is a reference, kind of explicating the characterization of them as a specific character type in the Quran as liars, right? Which that word does not actually appear in the original verse, right? So they play, rhetoricians will play a lot with the verse to actually steer a certain interpretation in a certain way. In this case, through amplification and interruption. Sometimes it's actually by deleting and shortening something, right? In this case, we have amplification, right? The major premise of this analogy is those who lie about God are refuted by God's command. The minor premise would be God commands Muhammad to refute the lie of the Jews. And the conclusion would be that God commands Ma'mun to refute the lie of the Hadith folk, right? And so by implementing his mihna and referencing in this way in the mihna letter, he's basically suggesting that his condemnation of the Hadith folk, in fact, fulfills a universal principle in the Quran that we condemn liars. God wills that liars be condemned. Another example from Ma'mun's mihna against the Hadith folk is his reference to Quran 47:23-4. The original verse reads, those are the ones, again, right? It's this kind of vague designation, those who do this and those who do that, right? Where they're characterized by certain actions, not by names per se, right? Those are the ones whom God has cursed and made deaf and blinded their sight. Do they not consider the Quran, or are there locks on their hearts? Again, reference to considering the Quran, we can kind of readily understand why Ma'mun would pick this verse for his mihna test, right? Do they not consider the Quran, right? So he's drawing on the metaphor of deafness and blindness here, which are details of a curse. God has cursed those ones, right? Now, those ones in the Qur'anic context, the verse, a couple verses before this in verse 20, so really the audience has to have some awareness of the Quran. They would kind of know from familiarity with the canonical text that there's a verse just before this one that is referring to hypocrites among the emerging believers community of Muhammad who don't fight when the Quran, verses in the Quran are revealed telling them to fight, right? These are hypocrites. Those are the ones whom God has cursed and made deaf and blind, right? In the Mihna, those people are likened to the Hadith folk who, like the hypocrites who won't fight when the Quran tells them to, the Hadith folk selectively ignore verses in the Quran that don't suit their comfort, right? So when the Quran says, we have made this an Arabic Quran, Ma'mun says, this is a clear verse, you're ignoring it, just like these guys ignored verses selectively that they didn't like, right? And the result is that God has made them deaf and blind. Now, in this case, we have a little abridgment, right? Previously, we had an amplification to the reference. Here, he's actually cut out, God has cursed, right? Maybe he thought it was a little too harsh. They definitely don't like to say curse disbeliever outright. Kind of makes you look like a little too rabid in your attacks, but also because it's not really necessary in order to convey the details, right? The details of the curse are there. They are made deaf and made blind. So eliminating this phrase does nothing to diminish the impact of the analogical claim, right? So the major premise here, hypocrites are cursed with deafness and blindness. The minor premise, that Hadith folk are cursed with deafness and blindness. The conclusion, which is suppressed, is that the Hadith folk are hypocrites, right? In fact, we have both major and conclusion suppressed, right? And Ma'mun, in this case, is fulfilling the principle of the major premise, which is that hypocrites are to be condemned, right? They are cursed and condemned, and he is a vehicle of that principle. the final example I'm going to show you is an example that is particularly interesting because it is a variation of a conditional enthymeme, where one of the premises is a condition, if something, something, right? So that's a special type of enthymeme. So that's interesting because we're playing on a conditional enthymeme. We're also actually using a conditional enthymeme from the Qur'anic. The Qur'anic text itself is giving us a conditional here and is being modified, right? So the Qur'anic conditional syllogism here is major premise is God loves not the treacherous, right? The minor premise is the conditional, if you fear treachery, right? And then the conclusion is actually a command, in the imperative mood in the Quranic text, default against them, right? I'm sorry, this example is actually from the Alid loyalists of the first fitna, right? So these are partisans of Ali ibn Abi Talib defending Ali's caliphate against Muawiyah and the rebels in Syria in the 7th century. So these guys are quoting this to justify fighting with the Syrians. We have defaulted against you, for God loves not the treacherous. So the Alid loyalist enthymeme here. So we have two changes to the text, right? We have defaulted. The conditional has changed into a certainty, right? In fact, this is actually suppressed, right? But the fact that the conclusion that emerges from the conditional premise is in fact fulfilled implies that in fact the Syrians have fulfilled the condition for them defaulting, which is that they are treacherous, right? So here the major premise is given. We have a suppressed conditional that, and this is one of the fascinating things about Quranic referencing, is that by changing the mood or tense of a verb, they can actually signal a suppressed premise. Does that make sense? Right, so it's really a very clever and effective way to steer the political demonstration. So what I'm working with now, thinking about all this as I continue to do my research, is, first of all, what it means when we're talking about looking for universal principles in the Quran. Now, the function of analogy is that the major premise usually of an analogy is some sort of universal presumptive belief. So the very fact that we associate these major premises with universals is what piques our interest in, so we would be dealing with Quranic universal principles. Now, why do we care about that? Because that is something that a lot of people are caring about right now. A lot of Muslims, when you ask them about how do you make the Quran relevant to your life today, this document, that has so many, what seems to be arguably vestiges of the 7th century context, how do we make this old text something meaningful today? And more often than not, the answer is, well, there are certain universal truths in the Quran, and the modern and postmodern contemporary exegetes of the Quran are very interested in trying to discern, and it's not easy to do, to discern what are the universal principles that are transferable across time and place and different milieu, whether you're living in a Western secular democracy of the 21st century. What are the principles of the Quran that are really to endure and be our guide, right? So that's why it matters. Now, the interesting thing about the analogical use of the Quran is that it does give us very clear indicators of how certain people think about universals in the Quran. At least in a rhetorical context, they've identified some universal premises in the Quranic text, right? And it's embedded in a discourse that is seeking meaning in the now and in that social world, right? So it's not just housed in some dusty bookshelf of tafsir literature, right, that seems in some ways detached from the lived experience, right? Although it's not, but it seems that way, right? This is really embedded in the social life itself when you're dealing with rhetorical commentary on the Quran, right? But, you know, even though rhetoric, you know, this sort of rhetorical and analogical use of the Quran does seem to be very promising in identifying universal principles of the Quran, we have a challenge of particularity, precisely because it is embedded in a particular discourse, and because it is embedded in a very contentious discourse where people are going to have all sorts of different ideas about who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, right? And so these principles are subject to oftentimes directly competing ideas of how they are transposed into the political landscape. And one of the fascinating things about Quranic references is you'll see actually competing politicians, both referencing Quranic character types of the, you know, predicates of believers and disbelievers in order to analogize themselves as the good guy, that guy is the bad guy, and they're doing it kind of in dialogue and competition with each other. So they're really using the lexicon and imagery of the Quran as a sort of verbal battleground or ammunition, so to speak. So the challenge of particularity is still there, right? Because it's still a question of application and transposition of these principles into ever-changing contexts. And the final thought that I'm working with now and that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on is the significance of typological reading. I find it particularly interesting to look at character types as sort of universal paradigms because the Quranic text itself seems to take this approach to scripture when it, for example, recasts in a new literary frame biblical stories, right? It usually does it precisely in this way where it's certain types of people being described and not always named and certain moral commentaries, you know, assigned to the story. And the Quranic references in political rhetoric are overwhelmingly drawing on character types, not specific scenarios, you know, of history, because you're not really going to get that in the Quran anyway, but moral character types, the good guys, the bad guys. It's because it has trans-historical value, cross-historical value, I think it's going to be interesting to look at how this typology is in fact transposed in various historical and discursive contexts, right? I mean, I've only been looking at 7th, 9th century. There are a couple scholars who are looking at contemporary, you know, like for example, Qaradawi's speech in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring, right, where he references Pharaoh in Egypt, which is very apropos to the rhetorical context, right? Arafat, there was an article on Arafat's use of the Quran. So it'd be very interesting to take a typological approach because that gives us sort of common frames of inquiry across the historical context. And that seems to be exactly what the rhetoricians want to do with character types, right, is that sort of historical transposition. Was there one more thought? Yeah, I can't think of what the last thought was now, so I'll just stop at that. So thank you very much for listening. I really look forward to hearing what you guys think. Thank you. Yes, sir.
One was when you, just a couple of slides back, it was 2 slides back, where you had was the reference, yeah, right there, right, what's the next? This one here.
The deaf and blind?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned a reference to hypocrites here. Is it the cursive that's your, I was trying to figure out where the...
Yeah, verse 20.
Oh, that's
So it's not, so the audience, and presumably Ma'mun, is familiar, he's really counting on his audience to remember that the Qur'anic context of this verse is with reference to the hypocrites. And the word hypocrites is explicated in, is it verse 20 or 21? Verse 20 says, they don't fight when they say, I forgot exactly how it goes, something about, they're waiting for a surah. It's like, where's the surah that tells us to do it? But when we send a revelation instructing them to fight, they don't, and they are hypocrites. And then we get this verse. And those are the ones whom God has cursed.
And this is an example of, so the premise suppressed here is has cursed being the major premise, right?
Right, the has cursed, the details of the curse are still evident, right? He's retained the details of deafness and blindness. So those are the ones whom God has made deaf and blind. Right, those are the ones whom God has cursed and made deaf and blind. Do they not consider? Right, so in this case we have God curses hypocrites is an suppressed major premise. And in fact, the Quranic verse itself doesn't say it, right? It's a logical supposition here, right, that, God curses hypocrites. And these particular people, because they are ignoring, right, passages, they claim to be backing up the prophet, but when it comes down to it, right, so that hypocrisy, right, God has cursed them, and as a result of that. And so the implication here is that the Hadith folk are hypocrites, right, and as a result, right, are deaf and blind.
Sorry, just a very brief follow-up.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you did, so like, what were some of the, so this was in the Mihna of,
Yeah, this is Ma'mun's Mihna.
what were some of the replies of the Hadith folk to this, this particular, I don't know.
That's interesting. We don't have a whole lot of record
Right.
of them, but we do have some exchange between Ma'mun. Now, I have to say, I was focusing on Ma'mun. Now, the Mihna was implemented for many years after the death of Ma'mun, who, poor guy, died just a couple months after implementing it, right? So I was really interested in Ma'mun's interaction with specific individuals during his last months. And we do, in fact, have, in the history of Tabari, and I believe Ibn Abi Tahir as well preserves at least parts of these letters, we actually have Ma'mun got a response from one of the people being interrogated where this person did a couple Qur'anic references. One was the kind of Qur'anic reference that Ma'mun did, where he was actually citing doctrinal proof texts from the Qur'an. So, for example, Ma'mun had given like 14 strings of Qur'anic verses to show that the Qur'an is created in time. The first and foremost being, we have made this an Arabic Qur'an. And he said, what else could made mean if not created? And then other things like, and we tell you stories. Well, stories are from the past. If it's from the past and then the Qur'an's telling, that's in time, right? These are the kinds of things that Ma'mun is doing. So one of the references that the Hadith guy gives back is actually giving another interpretation to a proof text. But then he also does this more kind of subtle Qur'anic referencing, not so much for a theological argument, but for a rhetorical and political one, where the targeted person, I'll probably not quote it correctly, but he basically quotes a passage from the Qur'an and tweaks it in a similar fashion, saying, I am one of the people who, when I'm under pressure, right, but I stay firm on the inside, or something like that. And then Ma'mun actually goes back to him, and he actually engages with the Qur'anic context. He says, no, you're misreading that verse, because that verse is talking about the people who suppress good when they're being tormented. But you are suppressing bad like a hypocrite. So he turns it back on him again and gives an alternative approach to his Qur'anic reference, saying, no, that doesn't apply to you, because you're inside out, right? So there's this battle back and forth with not only the proof text, but with actually situating ourselves as political actors as the good guy or the bad guy. Yeah, thank you.
So the text of Quran
Right.
is theoretically transmitted by God
Right.
Muhammad,
Mm-hmm.
and Muhammad would recite it, and somebody would write it.
Yeah, eventually they would write it down, yeah.
They would write it down.
But primarily they would memorize it and recite it themselves. So the writing process was a little bit more gradual. But in the big scheme of things of scriptural canonization, actually very rapid, like within 30 years.
Right.
That's the traditional account of the canonization of the Quran. Right.
So any, once it's written though, that is agreed upon some group that
Right.
this is the text
Right, this is the authoritative version.
version at a certain point in time.
Yeah,
And that cannot be changed.
right.
However, that has changed itself from
You mean in the process of referencing?
this process.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point. It raises there are two things I want to say in response to that, if I may. The first, shortly, is that it does seem to imply that there is a fixed canonical text, right? But one can imagine that one could reference a text that isn't necessarily a fixed canon, but it's harder to imagine that referencing a scripture that doesn't have some sort of canonicity, even if it's not written down, but has some sort of standard, as a point of reference. So it does have implications for the canonical textual history of the Quran. But more to your point of the changing of the Quranic text, it's really interesting that we seem to be, in a way, doing something very taboo, right? This intermingling of a very sacred text and language with very profane language, right? Yeah, very taboo. And there are a couple of things I would say about that. Number one, that's exactly why they do it, is because they want to sacralize their speech. If it didn't have that sort of exalted status, it probably wouldn't be as useful for them. It's also interesting that the Quranic text is revealed in Arabic so that you may understand, and the fact that the text is comprehensible and resembling human Arabic. Now, it's not the same in terms of its ontogeny. I mean, it's of divine origin, but it is comprehensible to someone who knows Arabic on some level, right? If we cast aside the theological question of can we ever fully understand God, right? And so it's that liminal status of the language. It's sacred, but it's also kind of accessible, that makes it very useful. Now, there are language theorists, rhetorical theorists and grammatical theorists at the time, especially after, it was really not until after Ma'mun, maybe about 100 years or so, that we start to get clear doctrines about the inimitability or ijaz of Quran, that the Quran is rhetorically perfect and cannot be imitated, and that attempts to imitate it could in fact be an affront to the sanctity of the text, right? In general, the idea was that there's a difference between a mocking imitation or a trickery, kind of trying to pass off something not Quranic as Quranic, and a imitation of the Quran to beautify your own speech. Now, these are gray areas, of course, but generally the theorists were concerned with one's intention about respecting the text. Now, someone could say that this is quite a violent act against the text, right? You're basically, hacking it around and, maybe trying to pass it off as your own. Sometimes the things that they do to the verses are so meddling that you almost don't realize they're Quranic verses anymore, right? And one could also say, well, their intentions are not beauty either. So, I mean, it definitely isn't, something that they really did care about. But the fact is that the earliest, like, for example, the early companions, like Ali and so forth, these people who are lauded for their eloquence and their piety, are credited. I mean, the authenticity of alid letters is, of course, much more debatable, you know, in terms of documentary authenticity than Ma'mun letters are. But the idea is that they are kind of credited with doing exactly this, of citing the Quran amply in their own rhetoric.
But isn't it, once you have a holy book involved in politics and therefore rhetoric,
Yeah.
that it is bound to have a conflict, and it is
Yeah.
bound to be inadequate.
What is the Quranic text or the rhetoric?
In comparison, both.
Mhm.
Once you compare whatever you want to call a perfect text with a totally imperfect and at times, as you said, you know, biased.
Oh, always
Always
biased.
biased.
Yeah,
Me
and
against
sometimes quite meddling.
I
Right.
am correct, but
Mhm.
I see it this way.
Right.
In this perfect thing.
Right.
That
Right.
either one becomes, well, once it's not in the politics, it's unworldly. This is
Right.
regards
Right.
whatever
Right.
else you want to do,
Right.
but not in this world.
Right. Yeah, there are a few things that are really interesting about what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
So you see this in Iran, 30
Mhm.
some years, 36 years of politicized
Yeah.
Quran.
And even the use of the Bible in American politics, we have the same phenomenon. I mean, this is not unique to Muslims either. Right. But the fact that they are appealing to the Quran as a lens through which to understand their social world, whether they are going to wrangle over the correct interpretation or not, it is, first of all, an interpretive exercise. It's just a different mode of interpretation than, say, conventional tafsir literature or something like that. But it is a mode of interpretation, and the fact that they're appealing to it for rhetorical authority is really a nod to its authority, right? Because the whole idea is that it would be presumably the most authoritative thing, right? So in that respect, it's a certain reverence, but then the question is, well, but it's for expedient purposes that may in fact be against what someone else thinks is maybe the purpose of the Quran or the teaching of the Quran. And that is, of course, the challenge of all forms of textual interpretation. There's something else you said that made me think of something, and now I can't remember what it is.
Then the caliphate, you know, itself it collapsed, and now you know
There are attempts to
Ottoman
revive it.
Empire is not here,
Mhm.
and all these pockets of springing up
Well, the other thing interesting about the Quran is that the Quranic text itself talks about divine intervention in human affairs. So from that perspective, it's not surprising that they would want to continue that process of punctuating our lived experience with the Quran. And no one, by the way, is attempting to pass it off as a new canonical text. I mean, Ma'mun would never claim that what he's doing is new revelation or that he's rewriting the Quranic text. And in fact, the interesting thing about the textual history of the Quran is that we don't have different kind of versions the way we do to the Bible. Right. Were you going to say something?
I do, yeah, I have a question. Much more down to earth question.
Okay.
Almost banal. No, I'm curious because you have such a nuanced understanding of kind of the, you know, the sequence of historical events. And you showed us a really sophisticated kind of way of thinking about how these politicians, how these rhetoricians are manipulating the text in order to make their point, using Aristotle, using Aristotelian, you know,
Right.
Concepts.
Right.
So I wonder about Ma'mun. I mean, was he?
Right.
He was before the
Right.
of Aristotle.
Yeah.
I mean, is he like? What is the process for him? Does he
Right.
have any kind of awareness of this? You know, of how he's manipulating the text?
Mm-hmm.
Think that he's just going on instinct and
Right. Right.
you know, which obviously to put some
Yeah.
power is, you know.
Yeah, that's a really good question because, I mean, my personal view is that, I mean, my instinct, I guess, to use your word, is that on some level I think rhetoric is a natural, you know, just like communicating with language is something natural, you know, making associations between like things. Well, if we're alike in one way, we may be alike in another way. That seems to be something almost hardwired with people. So I think on some level, Matmoon, whether or not he were an intellectual or learned in Aristotelian rhetorical theory, would do these things, and then a theorist, as we tend to do, will come along and be like, oh, let's, you know, theorize this, right? And that's, of course, what I'm doing, right? Now Matmoon was by all accounts, a learned intellectual, and in fact the Mihna is one of his very famous attempts to intervene in an intellectual way. Oh my gosh, I forgot the last thing I was going to say.
Do you see a difference when people want to
I thought of
absorbed? Do you see a difference
right.
in the way that references?
So contemporary to Matmoon, we have Jahiv.
Right.
He's the most prominent and influential theorist of rhetoric that would actually be contemporary with him. And he's not really working so much within the Aristotelian tradition. And Jahiz's work is not as comprehensive theoretically as Farabi and Ibn Rushd. So what Jahiz does in his Bayan wa Tabyin, this is the main source that I used, which is Lucidity and Clarification, right, is this book, he gives examples of effective rhetoric or beautiful speech. And in the beginning of the Bayan, is where it's really heavy Qur'an loaded, where he's actually quoting passages from the Qur'an in order to make his one of the main claims in his introduction, which is that the Qur'an is the inspiration for all excellent speech. So he cites verses from the Qur'an that use the word bayan, right? That this is bayan, like lucid understanding and so forth. And then he gives examples of like how people like Ali and other people. And he actually is aware of Aristotle, because in the Bayan wa Tabyin he mentions Sahib al-Mantiq, the logician,
The rhetoric came into Arabic much later than the other texts.
Yeah.
So you didn't necessarily
Yeah.
know the rhetoric.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I wouldn't be able to claim, right, that Matmoon was aware of Aristotelian theory. Or even Jahiz. I mean, he may not have even necessarily been aware of what Jahiz was doing, although there is evidence to suggest that he was.
Do you see a difference in how they deploy these rhetorical strategies once they do know Aristotle, or not discernible?
I have not noticed a significant difference, right, in the performance itself, right? No, that's a really good question, though. I think would be great to do further research comparatively, you know, in different time periods and different cultural milieus. And your point about Iran would be, you know, get me, oh, okay, well, so a Muslim community where Arabic isn't the common language of politics, how do we transpose Qur'anic text, which is Arabic? And so, for example, if I wanted to quote the Qur'an in an American English language political speech, I would, I guess, have to translate it, but then that's a whole Pandora's box of translation, and is it going to be as effective? You know? Yeah. I think, Maita, you had your hand up. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you for your time. I had a couple of, I guess, related questions. Examples that you mentioned, I think, primarily are letters. Do you have a sense of whether these tactics were primarily employed by text and to
Right.
audience of like peers, or were they given in sermons to like a broader public audience?
That's a really great question. Yeah.
Question one. And then the second question was, you mentioned at the start, these typically were in a context of a conflict.
Yeah. That was my focus, right, on fitna discourses, civil war discourses.
So I guess my question on that, along those lines would be, were they not using analogies when talking about other topics, or were they just not referencing the Quran in their analogies?
The latter is that they're not referencing the Quran as much. When they do, my claim is that any time that's happening, it may not always be in great amplitude or explicitness, but there is some sort of analogical reasoning going on. That's my proposal. But I think that is kind of a fundamental aspect of Qur'anic referencing as a phenomenon. It just so happens that Qur'anic referencing as a phenomenon is, from as far as I can tell, and of course I haven't, not familiar with every possible, body of work that we could look at for that sort of data, but from what I can tell, when things are going okay, or when there's, now what we do, in other words, when things are going okay, there's less recourse to the Quran. It's really, and for example, in the Fitna civil war with Ma'mun and Amin, where he fought to get the caliphate, we have, it starts out with just an occasional allusion, and then as things kind of decline in terms of diplomatic relations, the referencing gets more and more and more, right? And we find that actually in a lot of fitna discourses. The more crisis, the more urgent, the more referencing. We do find Quranic referencing sometimes in friendly advice, right? A counselor, will remind a leader of some sort of thing in the Quranic text. But this is, by comparison, much less common, at least from what I've read. Yeah. What was it? The first
part was,
question?
is the audience kind of...
Oh, yeah, that was a good question, too, yeah.
I guess, kind of upper level, or is it for the masses, and is it text versus speech?
It's a great question because both the mode of discourse and the audience of the discourse, direct audience and passive kind of eavesdropping or intercepting audiences, all these things matter. So it's really, right, great questions. As far as I can use the Mihna letters as an example. These were written from what we can tell. The chancery was very well developed by this time, as was the postal service, right? So the idea of letters being sent would have been very reasonable. We have transcripts of these letters in the historical sources. That's how we get them, from Tabari and Ibn Abi Tahir. Ibn Abi Tahir was definitely, he was the contemporary of Ma'mun. Tabari used Ibn Abi Tahir as a source. And Ibn Abi Tahir probably, he was involved in some ways as in secretarial craft, but he probably didn't have access to the archives where Ma'mun's letters would have been, so it's not totally clear how he got them to transcribe into his history. But that's where we get them, and we are led to believe that these were in fact written documents, but one of the letters actually says, read this letter out to the people in your jurisdiction, and that sort of thing. So really the Mihna letters are being written with a very kind of long-ranging vision of who his audiences are going to be. They're not actually addressed to the Hadith folk. The Hadith folk are addressed in the third person, and so he doesn't have to change the third person of the Quran. Those are the ones who are cursed. He keeps the third person because they are his third person, right? He's writing to his judge, saying, yeah, whatever his name was, you were him, interrogate those guys, so he's kind of schooling his judge in the logic and argumentation that he's supposed to now kind of by proxy represent Ma'mun's Mihna. And so read this. Another example is like his victory speech in Khorasan during the Civil War, right? We have kind of a transcript of it in Tabari, but it was undoubtedly something delivered orally. Right, so we have, this idea of multiple audiences. And another example would be like Ma'mun's letter to the Byzantine emperor, a Christian, where he cites Quranic references. Now, what use would it be citing the Quran to someone who first of all, may not be familiar with the text, and if they are, they don't value it as presumptive belief that would be an effective starting point of analogy. But he does it anyway, and one of the explanations I propose is that because he's aware of passive audience, he is aware that this is a public act in a way that he's doing, and there are other people eavesdropping on this rhetoric, and he wants his Muslim subjects to know he's going to bat. And he also does want the Byzantine emperor to know, like it or not, believe in the Quran or not, it has an impact on our relationship.
I have a question, but I don't know if it makes sense or not. I'm just trying to figure it out in my head. But does Qur'anic referencing ever happen via tafsir? I mean, does that happen, or?
Where a politician will reference a tafsir work?
And then,
or
something like that. Yeah, referencing tafsir, wanting to reference a particular.
That is such a cool question because it really touches on something on my next step on my research agenda is kind of trying to connect this to the conventional exegetical genre a little more. I have not so far seen rhetorical reference to tafsir literature, certainly not explicitly, probably because it doesn't have the value that the Qur'anic text itself has. It's just another guy's interpretation of the text, right? And of course, the tafsir, the mufassir community was, always kind of, every new tafsir was justified for improved methodology to get us closer to what the true meaning of the text is. But, so there was always this awareness of kind of, competing ideas of what the text means. So we don't see them referencing tafsir works rhetorically, probably because, it's just not as strong a premise. But sometimes the material that we do come across in tafsir literature, especially those that deal maybe with the context of the Muhammad and the believers community, the Asbab and Nuzul literature, like it was on this occasion this verse was revealed and Muhammad was dealing with the Meccans at this time and they were fighting. So this verse referring to the disbelievers is a reference to the Meccan pagans that he was fighting at this time and, Battle of Badr or something like that, right? So sometimes that is implied in rhetoric, and sometimes it seems like they want the audience to maybe know that, but really, from what I can tell, that's at most of secondary interest to the rhetoricians, because even that sort of context that the exegetes and you can see why the tafsir folks would care about it, but the rhetoricians not so much, because for them, the typological approach, first of all, does not necessitate that sort of historical, you see? Right.
What about hadith?
Hadith is referenced rhetorically.
Do you see in the same text both Quran and hadith?
In the texts that I've studied, I've seen a few, but I have to confess it's difficult for me to answer that, partly because I wasn't looking. So the fact that I didn't come across anything may just be the result of me not looking hard enough. It's also probably because my familiarity with the Hadith corpus. You really have to kind of know the Qur'anic text to recognize Qur'anic text. Of course, the rhetoricians are banking on that, and as a researcher, I need to have that. I need to be able to recognize Qur'an, right? I'm not as familiar with the Hadith corpus, so even if I were looking, I may not have quite as much familiarity with the material to notice it. Part of the reason why I'm not familiar with the Hadith corpus, or couldn't possibly be as familiar with it, is because it's so much bigger. So when we're getting issues of fixedness and canonicity, yes, I mean, the Hadith corpus is, and maybe for that reason, this lack of fixedness, it's even greater historical embedment. Hadith literature, unlike the Quran, is less typological in its structure and intellection. So and it's less presumed belief than the Quran. So for all those reasons, I think that's why we don't see reference. We do see reference to the Hadith on occasion, but really rarely compared to Quranic reference, which seems to be much more happening in the political rhetorical milieu. Now compare that with the legal. Legal analogy is much more likely to use Hadith. Yeah.
Okay, I think with that we have to wrap it up, so we have to get out of this room.
Thank you.
We're turning into pumpkins now. So
Right. Thank you so much for having me.